So dear all, welcome. Great to see you all again. Today we have our last Big Ideas for Democracy lecture of this season. We do have a couple more seminars still to come, but this is the final Big Ideas for Democracy lecture. And our speaker today is certainly saving the best for last. Sergiu Ghergina is Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Glasgow, where he is based in the Department of Politics and International Studies. His work spans a broad range of questions at the heart of contemporary political science, party politics, political participation, legislative behavior, democratic innovations, and Central and Eastern European politics. Professor Ghergina is a scholar also of remarkable productivity and range. His publication record stands at over 210 items, the large majority of them in top international journals such as Party Politics, Political Studies, Western European Politics, and Electoral Studies. He has also authored and edited several books on political parties, elections, and democratic innovations, including most recently his 2024 volume on political parties and deliberative democracy in Europe, A Convenient Relationship, published by Routledge. Beyond his own research, Sergiu is also a leader in the academic field. He is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, editor-in-chief of the journal Politics, associate editor of Migration Studies, and editor of the Routledge book series on democratic innovations. And today he will present his ongoing work on democratic innovations beyond established democracies, challenges, and developments in Europe. The lecture will run for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by again, plenty of time for questions and discussion. So Sergiu, as a Prias Fellow, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. That was the best introduction I have ever witnessed. It's a pity that my head of department was not here to secure a promotion or something. So it's the first time, I'll start with a caveat, it's the first time when I stand still when doing a presentation. Not even when I talk on my phone, I stand still. So it's going to be a massive challenge to me not to move. Our friend here and photographer told me that I can do this. So sometimes if you see me doing this, don't panic. It's just normal. So, as Sylvia mentioned, this is an ongoing thing, and I'll tell you in a bit how I ended up with this research agenda. I'm going to talk today about democratic innovations beyond established democracies, and as explained in a couple of in the first 3 slides, you'll understand how I came to this. What are democratic innovations? Just to start with a general discussion about what they are, because it is a relatively generic term, and there is very little consensus in the literature about it. Although there were thousands of works written about it, many people refer to democratic innovations in various ways. There is a generous interpretation of the term, and of course we have scholarly disagreement. For the sake of simplicity and pragmatism, this is the type of definition that I decided to adopt for our discussion today, because this is shared among many scholars, especially those focusing on Europe, because as you probably noticed, the talk is going to be focusing on Europe. It was way too broad to go beyond Europe. You'll see that it's broad enough as it is. If I went beyond Europe, it would have been even broader. So what are the democratic innovations? I see them, and not only me, but scholars see them as alternative models of decision-making in which citizens are engaged directly, without mediators, without other institutions. Those type of models mark a shift from a vote-centric dimension in which people simply vote what they are told. They are asked to vote for a person who can represent their interests, to a talk-centric conception of engagement characterized by exchange of ideas, reason, judgment, and inclusiveness. So again, for the sake of simplicity today, I'm going to focus on 2 main elements, the direct and deliberative practices. There are many other forms that can go under democratic, not that many other forms that can go under democratic innovations, but for the sake of my 40 minutes of glory today, I wanted to make sure that I can fit within a specific scope condition. So we're going to talk about direct and deliberative practices. We'll see that these are also quite diverse. Now, what we know from existing research is a lot about these 2 forms, direct and deliberative democracies, in established democracies. Why? Because they are tied into the broader framework of representative democracy in 2 ways. One of these is what Dewey said a century ago, that the cure for democracy is more democracy. So these democratic innovations are a way in which the quality of representative democracy can be enriched outside the realm of representative democracy. So that is the sort of more normative type of approach. The empirical type of approach is that they complement rather than replace representative democracy. This is the consensus. If there is a consensus in the literature, is this one, that they are not here to replace representative democracy, but they are on top of representative democracy. They can help mitigating the risks that representative democracy has at this moment. And then what we have from these established democracies, extensive evidence about how democratic innovations emerge, how they function, and what effects they have in democracies. And when we speak about effects, we refer here to the function of education of citizenry. People know more after they engage in these things, to policy dimension, policy outputs. We can talk about that if necessary. And yet, in spite of that, in spite of the fact that there is a lot of evidence and a lot of studies on that, those countries, on those established democracies, we can see that several new democracies, illiberal regimes, and transition countries, or hybrid regimes, whatever you want to call them, experiment with such practices. And that was the moment when I started feeling attracted to this. I said, okay, fine. These people use them, and yet there is very little on it. So that was the moment when I started looking at these countries. Especially that many countries adopted rules and regulations for democratic innovations sometimes before they established democracies. They were fine on paper, but they did, and a few decades later they decided to experiment with them. In that sense, putting these two together, I came up with a question for myself. What happens to democratic innovations in political settings struggling with representative democracy? Because new democracies don't struggle necessarily, but they just institutionalize, they just consolidate representative mechanisms. But the illiberal regimes, or the de-democratizing countries, the backsliding countries, the hybrid regimes, they clearly struggle. And that will be the purpose of my talk today. I know it took me 7 minutes to come to the purpose, but this is it. I would like to basically map a bit what happens with the democratic innovations, what are the general conclusions of the literature, of the research in the field. You will see some graphs, you will see some figures. All of them are from open access journals. Some of them are from my research, but I don't like to put my name on the slide, so that's why you won't see the sources necessarily. But you can easily identify the articles just by putting the name of the case and the name of the or what I'm going to present. But all of them are absolutely open access from published works. One of the first things that is clearly visible in this type of countries is that there is great variation in use. So much of the talk today is going to be empirically oriented, because I see myself as a more empirical person. Of course, I also have theoretical interests, but I'm intrigued a lot by what happens, and I want to explain what happens and why it happens. We see two types of variations. First, we see great variation between the forms of democratic innovation. So at the end of this talk, you'll understand that we cannot really talk about what happens outside established democracies in a sort of coherent way. It's going to be very separate, very divided types of discourses. We'll get to that in 15 slides. But what we observe now is that what we have observed so far is that we have a great variation in use between the forms of democratic innovations. So, for example, we know that referendums are much more frequent than citizens' initiatives or recalls, which are also direct democracy forms, or mini-publics at all the levels, national, subnational, regional, local, it doesn't matter. We notice that there are more democratic innovations at the local level. Well, so far, nothing new, because basically these are trends that we observe also in established democracies. But what we also observed in these countries is that the public engagement differs greatly, with direct democratic forms being much more popular than deliberative forms. Although, in theory, as we will see in a couple of minutes, people appreciate more what deliberation has to offer. So they appreciate it more, but they don't engage, or they are not willing to engage. We'll see in a moment why. The second type of variation, so that's between the forms of democratic innovations. The second type of variation is between the countries. We have, in terms of direct democracy, countries differ in terms of a referendum use. Many do not allow citizens initiatives or recalls. In their legislation, you are not allowed to call for a recall for your member of parliament or for the mayor. Others allow for these things, but they have never used it. Others allow, they have used it. In terms of deliberative democracy, many countries use participatory budgeting. An increasing number of countries use participatory budgeting at the local level, and a couple of countries use mini-publics. So again, we cannot really speak about a trend across the region, across these countries. Now, we're getting to one of my favorite parts, explaining things. So, in explaining what happens, is I focused on the supply and on the demand side, the sort of typical approach in comparative politics for various explanations, and especially in party politics, elections, and all that. Now, supply side is institutions, politicians, those who actually organize, who initiate, who have a sort of big stake in these sort of things most of the times. We'll see that also citizens have a stake. But in general, what we noticed is that there are 3-4 major explanations why things look the way they look in these countries. And the first one is that many referendums, so we start with direct democracy, it's going to be always direct and deliberative in this order. I know that alphabetically it should have been deliberative and then direct, but it's chronologically. Direct was before deliberation. So that's why it was more natural to act that way. What the research concluded, what studies concluded so far, is that many referendums in Central and Eastern Europe, or I'll call it sometimes Eastern Europe, are organized top-down by the political elites rather than bottom-up by the citizens. And that is due to a couple of factors, like civil society has been weak for 2 or 3 decades, people find less time to organize for this because they have to fight for survival due to economic grievances, all those sort of things. So the conclusion is that at the end of the day, 80% of the referendums in these countries are initiated by political elites, even more. At the European level, it's 52-48. If you look comparatively across the referendums organized since 1970, in the last 50 years, until 2024, research shows that it's relatively equal. When it is organized by political elites and by citizens, in these countries is mostly political elites. And why do they do this? Because they have things to gain from using direct democracy. What most of the research tells us is that there is a very high level of political instrumentalization of these tools, of these practices. Political parties and politicians use referendums to their own benefit, either to augment their control over power or to undermine the government if they are in opposition. So if they are in government, they want to increase their control, to boost their legitimacy. If they are in opposition, they use these against the government. And this is, the bigger picture looks more or less like this. The way in which they instrumentalized can be summarized like this. We have a 2x2 matrix in which we have the type of intended goals. Is it towards policy or institutional? And then if we look at the type of action, is centripetal, oriented towards their own party, towards themselves, egoistic type of thing, or then centrifugal versus the opponents trying to attack the others, trying to steer the opponents away. And then those are, in the cells, there are forms of what they can do with referendums. And I'll show you in a minute how they actually did it in a couple of countries. So they can use referendums to set the agenda or to diminish the agenda setting of the others, to increase popularity and increase legitimacy, so that's for themselves. They can use it for policy purposes in terms of popular mobilization or electoral gains, and on the other hand, for institutional, for themselves, strengthening their party organization or avoiding deadlocks or creating deadlocks with referendums, bypassing institutions or calling for early elections. Because with a referendum, you can push for early elections if the government or if the opposition don't get support on several things. So this is an example from Slovakia, and these are all the referendums between 1994 and 2010, and how they were used. So what you see there, it's an excerpt from a much larger table. It's basically how they were using referendums. So each cell is one of the referendums used in Slovakia. So as you can see, all of them have been used for one or the other purpose. A lot to harm opposition, a lot to increase electoral support, but also to harm the government and increase electoral support. So it's a combination of these things. So it's a clear strategy. If you observe it across 14 different referendums, it's clearly a strategy in that sense. And this is how they basically split in the table that I provided. So they have no institutional centripetal elements, but then all the others are, as you can see them. So when you see 1997, Q1, Q2, Q3, it means the number of questions in that referendum. Now, another example is Romania for in all their referendums, basically. So everything you see here is all the referendums that the country organized. So all of them have been used for instrumentally. Centripetal, party-oriented. So, for example, the most recent one, the anti-corruption 2019, that's why I put it in bold. It was the country president that had relationships with a political party, asking people to vote in a referendum that was boosting their agenda, that was boosting their electoral profile. So he framed it as anti-corruption referendum, but it was actually meant to boost the party profile in the European elections, because it took place at the same time with the European elections. Right, so that was the sort of instrumentalization of direct democracy. But there is also instrumentalization of deliberation. Political actors found ways to instrumentalize deliberation. They have been, in some cases, they have been initiated to give a false feeling of empowerment, to give people the impression that the elites care about what they have to say, how they engage, and what they bring to the table, but they were in fact controlled. One of the most obvious is the national consultations in Hungary. This was an innovation by the Fidesz government. I wouldn't call it democratic innovation. I'll call it just an innovation. In which, as you can see in the name, they are consultations. What happened was that millions of letters were sent to people in their mailboxes, and their opinion was asked for on a diversity of topics. The government called it deliberation because they said that people have the possibility to engage. Of course, there was no real deliberation because it was just a one-way type of communication, but which in fact served as communication tool for the government to rally political support around certain topics, to learn what is salient for the public, and then to promote policies on those areas, and then shape the public discourse. So they use this sort of thing for their political communication, political rhetoric. So it's not surprising that in the end, what they said matched very well what people expected, because they used this sort of thing, which they labeled as a deliberation to amass support and gauge their opinions. A second element that is shaping this sort of variation is the non-binding character of many of these tools. They are optional, they are consultative. Unlike in established and what we observed is that unlike in many established democracies, non-binding referendums are not implemented. They simply don't care about them. Once they achieve their purposes, because those instrumental purposes, if you remember them from a couple of slides ago, they are very short or medium term. Once the short term and medium term have been achieved, they just discard them. They leave them aside. Because what they can do, they can bring them up again. So if there is an issue, you have an issue with the former opposition party. A former opposition party was in favor of building a nuclear plant. You win on an environment positive type of discourse. You're happy with your victory, but then if the discourse comes back again, is picked up by another opposition party for the nuclear plant, you can resort again to the referendum and say, look, people voted against the nuclear plant, so that's what people want. So very often these non-binding referendums are there in standby, but they are never implemented, because if they get implemented, you lose the weapon, you lose the tool, you don't have it. And that happens unlike in established democracies, because in established democracies, we notice that governments or the initiators don't go against public opinion. Many people didn't know that Brexit was a consultative vote, but it became, the parliament didn't dare to go against the opinion of people, because it wasn't like people decided, yes, we want to leave the EU, it will automatically happen. No, it was a parliamentary decision. Parliaments don't go against public opinion. There has been a study done in many European countries showing that 80 to 90% of the non-binding referendums get implemented at national level. Now, going back to our guys, what we have in this case is a very similar type of argument. The initiators give people the feeling of power and engagement, but they have no follow-up unless they are constrained. Sometimes they were constrained. That's why I said in 80-90% they discard them, but in 10% there were some external constraints. There were some elements that came into the picture, and then they had to implement them. A third explanation is that they devote limited resources, and this is particularly obvious with respect to deliberation. So one practice that has a deliberative component is the participatory budgeting. I mean, I'm quite sure you're familiar with it, right? Good, brilliant. then very few have continuity. So many cities in that part of Europe and in the post-communist world or in hybrid, even in hybrid regimes, start the participatory budgeting, but very few have continuity because the local authorities do not allocate resources. They don't have an office dedicated to this. They don't have funds to advertise the whole thing. They don't have a sort of long-term strategy. Because, of course, if you don't devote resources, it's clear that you want to have it a one shot, two shots, and then that's it. End of story. End of the story. Evidence from interviews with those people organizing participatory budgeting show that the exercise is not seen as a long-lasting institution. So when they put it in place, they just put it, okay, let's see how this works. And then if it works, they say, fine, it worked, and then it stops. Or they say, fine, it didn't work, and then they don't try it again. So very, very often it's just a one-off type of exercise. In addition to not seeing it as a long-lasting, the local authorities often see it as a side job. Rather than seeing it as a way of interacting with citizens, bringing citizens in, making sure that they are part of the governance, part of the participatory processes, they just see it, yeah, fine, we're going to do this as a side job. And this has to do something with the side allocation, with the allocation of resources, because very few municipalities have an office for participatory budgeting. Very often is the office that does 3 other jobs, and they do this as well. And of course, when you have something like this, all the experiences in Paris, Edinburgh, Amsterdam show that it's not going to work unless you have dedicated offices to this. A fourth type of explanation is that politicians don't know what these things are. They don't know what the democratic innovations are. Of course, they know what referendums are because they understand the purpose of a referendum and they have been around for quite a while. But when it comes to deliberation, we notice that they don't know what it is. And it has not been used, especially if it has not been in the country. They don't pay attention to what happens in the neighboring countries or in famous countries. So I had discussions with politicians and I asked them, do you know about the Scottish Citizen Assembly or UK Citizen Assembly? And they said yes, because of course people they will rarely say no because they will look stupid and they don't want to do that. And then when I started getting into details, they had absolutely no clue what those things were, because of course they knew that they spoke about climate, but they had no idea what else, because it's in the name. So obviously that is the case. When we had when we had in-depth interviews, and when I say we, it's a sort of class of people, it's a category of people, those studying these sort of things, we noticed that actually they have no clue what deliberation is. Not even when you explain it to them, they don't understand it. They don't get the point of this. Unlike in many established democracies, politicians do not fear power sharing. So this is the benefit of this, because they don't know what it is. They don't have this fear, oh, we're going to share power with people if we adopt deliberative practices. But that is due to the fact that they associate deliberation with consultation. They understand deliberation even when it is explained to them, even when the procedures are outlined. They see it, oh yes, we're asking people what they think about it, so it's fine. They tell us and we decide what we do. So in that sense, this is a major difference compared to many politicians in Western Europe, where the fear of power sharing is still poignant. This is one of the things that we got in an article on the views of deliberation. So when we asked them what it is, 90% of the politicians that we asked said it is consultation. They didn't say the exact word consultation, but from what they told us, it was obvious that it was consultation. The second thing is that we asked them how deliberation happens or how it should happen. And they said, it was very, very funny to a large extent, they saw it as a political instrument. They saw it as a political instrument for themselves and as a political instrument for the opposition. So in the end, they were a bit baffled by what shall we do with this? Shall we use it for our own benefit, or shall we be afraid of it because others can use it? And then, so on the one hand, they saw it as a political instrument, and on the other hand, they saw it as something for the citizens. They said, no, this is not something that we have to deal with. That's something for the civil society. It's their playground. They can do whatever they want with it. And then when we asked them, where would you expect deliberation to occur, or where is deliberation very effective, they all said exclusively local. You cannot do it at national level. And it is funny because the number of citizen assemblies in Eastern Europe increases. It's clear that these people don't pay attention to what happens around them, even in neighboring countries, even in countries where they have a diaspora, or countries with which they have strong cultural ties. At the same time, much of this deliberation doesn't come from the politicians, but comes from the external pressure. So a recent study looking at Poland and Ukraine, comparing the two. So Ukraine now, so it's not before the war, we're talking at Ukraine since 2018 and as you can see 2024. So throughout the process, because this is the fascinating part, although Ukraine is in a war, they keep implementing experiment with the deliberative practices. So what we observe is that very often, if you look on the column of initiators, we see that it's very rare that only local authorities are there or national government. It's also EU institutions, international donors, that sort of external pressure that comes into play. And international donors are not there just for the money, but they also put in issues related to norms, elements that should be uncovered, all those sort of things. Moving to the demand side, so that's pretty much the big picture in terms of the supply side. So those are the things that very often how politicians approach those elements. Now, when we try to explain the variation from the demand side, from the people side, what do people want? How do people position themselves toward this? We see that referendum used to be very popular or are very popular because the turnout in referendums is very high due to their topics. Many first referendums in all these countries were about independence, about a new constitution, which is a big thing because most of these had either no constitution or they had a Soviet-style constitution from 20, 30 years before, or EU accession. All these super exciting type of things, right? So if you have a referendum on an exciting topic, it is very likely that the population is excited about them. So that's why the turnout in many referendums in Eastern Europe is on average higher than Western Europe because it happened on these types of topics in the beginning. And we know that people enjoy deciding on key topics and having another word to say between elections. But fatigue is also obvious. The fatigue that is obvious in Western Europe or in established democracies in general, even California and all the other states or countries that use direct democracy, is also visible in Eastern Europe, but not to the same extent because these guys don't go so crazy after referendums. Relative to salience is one thing. So the variation in support or variation in use of referendums, it has to do with how salient the topic is. There were several referendums organized on topics that are not salient and resulted in low turnout. There are a couple of funny ones, but I will choose one that is very counterintuitive. And my example is a referendum for the traditional family. This is how they called it, taking the Croatian example of 2013. Maybe you know in Croatia 2013 they changed the constitution to have this statement in their constitution: the family is the union between a man and a woman. 5 years later, Romania, driven by the Orthodox Church and the Coalition for Family, which was an NGO with connections with the Romanian Orthodox Church, did exactly the same. They said, we want to change the constitution, we want to add this paragraph in the constitution, this sentence in the constitution, so that we all know what a family is, because we cannot live in this relative world in which we don't know who marries who, right? So in theory, this was a salient issue. Everybody expected this to be a salient issue, since Romania is one of the most religious countries, actually it's in the world, it's the top, it's the most in Europe and one of the most in the world. So if you look at the level of self-declared religiousness among the Romanians is above 90%. I'm not talking about practicing, but if you ask them in a survey, are you religious or not, more than 90% they will say yes. And then if you ask them how often do you go, that's a different story. 40% will attend, or even less. But it's declared of religiousness, right? And since this element contrasted sharply with the idea of same-sex marriage and traditional family, everybody expected the referendum to pass. What happened was that the turnout was 21%, and for a valid is only 30%, so it's quite low. It's one of the lowest thresholds in the world, and yet it didn't make it. When doing interviews with people, especially in the countryside, where the religiosity is much higher than in the big cities, the general conclusion was that we don't care about the topic. What people do in their private lives is their business. Is not we cannot decide who should marry who. So to them, that was not a salient issue. They didn't associate that with a moral, ethical issue as the proponents, including the government, the Orthodox Church, were hoping for. So sometimes the proponents, the initiators, overestimate the saliency of an issue. When the issue is not salient, people simply don't go voting, and then many such referendums fail. It was an even funnier example when the president of Poland initiated one in 2015. They had a turnout of 7.9%, so almost nobody when voting. It was ridiculous. That for a different story, or for a different time, or for the Q&A. The second thing where we have this variation is that people associate democratic innovations with the initiators, like an extended arm of the initiator. The government does this, that means the government wants us to vote that way, or the government wants to convey a certain message. The referendum and the initiator are seen together. There are two types of reactions to this, of course. On the one hand, you have approving and participatory from initiator supporters, and on the other hand, you have a boycotting from the initiator's opponents. And in the previous example with the referendum on Romania, it was also a reaction against the Social Democrats and against the church that initiated it. So it was a more complex set of factors in that case, but saliency was one of the key ones. Coming back to this, we look at the Moldovan 2024 example. They had a pro-EU accession referendum. I don't know how much you know about the Republic of Moldova, but they have a Russian-speaking population, Romanian-speaking population. The Russian-speaking population often supports parties that are pro-Russia. The Romanian-speaking population often supports parties that are pro-European Union, pro-Romania, because Romania and European Union are associated. So what happened was that the pro-EU candidate to the presidential elections, who was the incumbent president, Maia Sandu, she coupled her entire campaign to this referendum. She had no other topic. It was the referendum. Yeah, fine. Yeah. I mean, when you say no other topic, of course she referred to economic things, but it was so minor. 8 out of 10 discourses were about this. If we don't go to the European Union, we're doomed. That was the sort of message. In a study that I did, when you look at the electoral support for Sandu, it predicts vote in referendum. The odds ratio is 3.6, statistically significant, which means that a person voting for Maia Sandu was more than 3 times higher, had odds higher than 3.5 times to vote in favor of the referendum compared to any other respondent. And any other respondent means those who didn't vote or who voted for a different candidate. So in that sense, it was clearly associated with it. In a different study, looking at Hungary between 2008 and 2022, and those are the 3 referendums initiated by Fidesz between 2008 and 2022. And you might think that they calculated to be every 7 or 8 years, but I'm quite sure it was just a coincidence. So it's 2008, 2016, and 2022. Probably you remember the last one. It was on LGBTQ+ issues. So we looked at 2, and I say we because that's part of something I did. We looked at 2 main characteristics. We were interested if people who are against democracy would favor support for referendums. So on the horizontal line is support for referendums. To what extent they support the idea of a referendum being organized in a country. And then we have two different variables. If they are against democracy because we expected to use the sort of referendum as a sort of alternative to what is happening, or if they vote for Fidesz MPP was their small coalition partner. And what we see is that already from 2008, when they were in opposition, because the 2008 was when Fidesz was in opposition, there is a quite high likelihood to support referendums if they are voters of Fidesz, but then in 2016 and 2022, it's insane. It's like odds ratios of 20 and 30, which means that it's almost deterministic. If you are a voter of Fidesz, you're in favor of referendums. If you're a voter of somebody else, you're against referendums. What we wanted to do is to make sure that this attitude is not mediated by the anti-democratic. So we ran an interaction effect, and these graphs say that basically it doesn't matter. If you're a Fidesz voter, your anti-democratic attitude doesn't matter. Because we found people with democratic attitudes among Fidesz voters. So not everybody who votes Fidesz is against democracy, but we found that. But what we noticed is that among the other parties, people who are against democracy, among the voters of other parties, people who are against democracy will favor a referendum because they see it a tool of Fidesz. We also followed up with several interviews to understand whether this was the mechanism, and indeed that was the case. So in this case, the initiator was driving the support for referendums. Now, a fourth or a third factor is that people support what they know. They support more referendums than deliberation on average, mainly because they know what they mean. They understand how they work. They've been around for a few years. They voted in a couple of those. Many people, if not, they saw their parents voting in a couple of those, their grandparents. So in the end, they sort of got accustomed to those. Nevertheless, the general attitude towards deliberative practices is positive, even in contexts in which they never use them. So in general, people like both, but they like referendums slightly more. So these are data, this is fresh baked data. I haven't done many analysis with it because there are ongoing surveys. I'm going to present you Czechia, Poland, and Romania. We had to wait for Hungary until after the election, precisely because of that effect. People still associated referendums with Fidesz. So referendums Fidesz, deliberation Fidesz. So we wanted to have a month between the election. The data collection started in Hungary today, as we speak, and we get the data from Slovakia, but I didn't have a chance to look at it. So Czechia, Poland, and Romania now, 2026, so 3 months ago. So what we see is that, so on a scale from 0 to 10 in terms of support, and the dots are the averages, but you can also estimate by the shape of the violin. So it's slightly more support, but relatively high for both. In Poland, considerably more for referendums, and that is counterintuitive because they have citizen assemblies at the local level. Poland is the leading country in the region, in spite of all the problems with the government, backsliding and all that, temporary backsliding and all that. They have citizen assemblies, and yet the support is higher for referendums. And then in Romania is high across the board. So what we observe is that there is a positive correlation between the support, so 0.41 in Czechia, 0.51 in Poland, 0.59 in Romania, which means that people who want one, many people who want one want also the other, but there are also discrepancies. People who want one do not want the other. And then what we notice is who supports these practices. Those who blame politicians, so politicians are the source of what is wrong in the country. Politically active people, those are the ones who like these sort of things, and those who are satisfied with democracy, which confirms what we know from established democracies. It complements the democracy. What we were very interested in is whether the party vote made a difference. Are you in favor of a party pushing the country towards backsliding? Are you in favor of a new party that advertises to do things in a new way? That doesn't matter. It doesn't. People don't align their partisan preferences to preferences for deliberative democracy or direct democracy. We also looked at ideology and age, and they have mixed effects, because in established democracies we know that young people favor more deliberation, old people often favor direct democracy. Here it was a mixed effect. So for those of you who are in love with numbers and statistics, this is the evidence for what I said in English a couple of minutes ago. Those are the effects for Czechia, these are the effects for Poland, and these are the effects for Romania. They resemble greatly. So in this sense, we can see quite a lot of similarity between across the three countries. Of course, there are some particular conclusions. Gender, for example, more female favor referendums in Romania and Poland, but then in Czechia it doesn't make a difference, and then more left-leaning in favor referendums in Czechia, more right-leaning in Poland and Romania. But these are contextual things. Now, I'm turning to another survey that we did in 2024 in Republic of Moldova, and we asked them the difference between do you support it and are you willing to engage? And this is about deliberation. We did on deliberation because until that moment, Moldova didn't have any deliberation whatsoever. We were lucky because 5 months later, they had their first citizen assembly. In the country, 32 people participated, and the funny thing is that one person that we interviewed is one of the participants in that citizen assembly. So basically, the person had a bit of knowledge before going to the citizen assembly. So this is a survey. It was accompanied by 80 interviews, 40 before the referendum, 40 after the referendum, but we asked on deliberation. So what we see is that very, very similar type of support for type of distribution for support and for participation, and everybody would expect, yeah, they are driven by the same thing. Actually, that's not the case. So what we observed is that support for democratic innovations is different than participation. The characteristics for participation resemble those in established democracies. So people are enthusiastic about the idea of a mini-public across the board. So nothing explains why they are enthusiastic. Political interest doesn't matter, ideology doesn't matter, urban, rural doesn't matter, nothing matters. But when it comes to do you want to get engaged, so they are fine, yeah, we can have a mini-public as long as we don't take part in it. When you ask them, do you want to take part in it if you are selected, only those who have high political interest would want to take part in it. Although we told them that these mini publics discuss local level type of issues, not necessarily political things. But the politically interested, the political efficacy type of people, and those who favor people as decision makers would engage. And it was very funny to see that those who trust the country president, the pro-European country president, would be willing to engage in this because they had less of a conspiracy theory type of thing. We derived that from the interviews because that was a puzzling thing. So we asked them, and it was clear that those supporters did not think that these deliberations would end up in the media or in the hands of the wrong people, while the supporters of the pro-Russian camp were more conspiracy theory oriented. And these are the results, the statistical results for what I just explained. So for the engagement, those are the statistically significant. So those that are further away from the dotted line at 1, those are statistically significant, one way or not. And one of the final things that we noticed is that the evidence shows that in some of these countries, especially in hybrid regimes, the use of deliberative practices can increase political trust. Well, it's not really difficult because it's quite low to begin with, so you can only grow from there. But of course, you can have the other thing that nothing changes. So what we noticed in Ukraine 2018 from the same author who did the comparison that I presented to is Dmitry Volodin, 2018, the trust levels in local authorities increased after people engaged in local participatory budgeting. They asked people who didn't engage, people who engaged, and they compared their levels of trust, and they were considerably higher among those who engaged because they saw the openness, the idea of openness. And they said, yes, democracy has problems overall, but if local authorities want us engaged in this, it means that they have nothing to hide. We understand how money is spent, all those sort of things. This happens in general. Everything I mentioned is at the citizens level, at voters level in general. But with party members, it's a funny thing. It's the other way around. So it's the other way around in the following sense. That things look different because we ask them what are their preferences for using direct democracy and deliberative democracy within their political party. So we ask only party members. What we noticed is that there are no visible differences in answers between government versus opposition parties, radical versus moderate, large versus small, using and not using democratic innovations, because some of these used democratic innovations and some didn't. So this is the results that we've got. For Romania 2024, these are 4 parties. Radical right, the sort of Flams-Belang type of thing, the first one. The liberals, but they are liberals like social liberals, more or less. That's like PVDA, the third one, more or less. It's the social, well, they call themselves social democrats, but they're more left than social democracy. And then that's the Save Romania Union. It's a populist pro-European party. I know it sounds funny, but that's what it is. So, and that's the party that uses USR, Save Romania Union, used referendums and uses internal referendums. So when we ask them, how would you use this, or where do you see the best use of these things? As you can see, they are super reluctant about direct democracy. Remember that many voters in these countries like direct democracy more than deliberative democracy. But these people, when presented with the idea of deliberative democracy, they are hyper enthusiastic about it. They see it as benefiting almost every element of their party organization: communication, organization development, electoral strategy, and internal problems. 2 of the parties were a bit reluctant that deliberation can actually solve internal problems, but they could. So coming back to the thing that politicians don't learn lessons, and they don't really, I mean, at least in these countries, they don't know what happened to other parties. There was a party that used deliberation, and it essentially collapsed because it used deliberation. The party didn't understand that deliberation has to be used on top of the regular party mechanisms, but replace the regular party mechanisms with deliberation. So every decision was taken through deliberation. And you can imagine what happened. Complete chaos, and the party dissolved without even running for a single election. Although it was a very promising party, and there were many intellectuals running the party. Maybe that was why they did it. They ended up in the chaos. To conclude, because I took slightly longer than what I anticipated. The practices often exist in these countries, but their functioning is questionable. We do not really know if they work properly, if the initiator actually intends to use them to use them in a genuine manner. What is going on there? And as you probably noticed from the last 40 minutes, there is a blurry and divided picture. We can hardly speak about these countries as a conglomerate, as going in a unitary direction. There are genuine democratic innovations in some countries, but there are also selective democratic innovations. They use whatever they like or whatever pleases them or whatever brings them benefits, or co-opted. There were elements in which it started as a genuine, but it got hijacked along the process. And then there are the third type of element is that there is also constrained innovation. And constrained is either by non-democratic norms, when you start with a nice idea but non-democratic norms come into play, or by external actors. Usually the last ones are seen as a positive type of influence, because in many countries that display those characteristics, illiberal regimes, de-democratizing countries, hybrid regimes, or new democracies, they push for reform usually. So for example, the first citizen assembly in Bosnia is due entirely to external pressure. The local actors tried for 10 years to organize something, but they failed, and now because of the external pressure and external help, they could secure it, and arguably they have some very positive results overall. So ending on this positive, or actually mixed note, negative and positive, I look forward to your questions and suggestions.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Very, very interesting. Who has a question?
Thank you for this very clear presentation. I have a question regarding the salience of certain innovations. I was also quite struck that about the low turnout on the referendum on same-sex marriages, and I was wondering what kind of media exposure do these referendums and deliberative initiatives have, and whether you also see variation in that, and whether that is also a possible, a possible cause why you see them sometimes very low salience on topics where you would expect a higher turnout.
Yeah, excellent question. Media was one of the things that I wanted to incorporate in my presentation, and then it went berserk because I had 5 slides only on that, and I said, no, I'll kick it out. And also I didn't know where to put it, supply or demand, because it plays a role there. Especially in these countries where the media is not often independent. It is on the government side, it gets public funding, massive public funding, private funding with shady sources, all those sort of things. So excellent question. 3 things. You asked about 3 things, actually. The first one is, what is the coverage? Indeed, the salient topics get coverage. That's why everybody expected that thing to be salient. It was all over in the newspapers, also because the government was advocating for it. They tried to push it. Social media was all over the place because it was against it. Young people were mostly against it, doing a lot of reels, doing a lot of TikTok videos, don't go voting, because they understood if you want to fail a referendum, you're more efficient boycotting it rather than going to vote no, because very often when you go to vote, the yeses are more than no, so they decided to boycott. So massive media coverage, and yet people didn't turn out voting because to many of them that was not a salient issue. They didn't care about it. So in terms of coverage can indeed ensure the turnout. I haven't checked for the correlation between the coverage and the turnout, and that's an excellent idea for our next study. But the second element that I see as being crucial is how do media report about what happens with these things in the aftermath? Because that's the main problem. So the way they function, the way they happen, it's fine. They exist, they are used to a certain extent. But the main problem is that the media forget about these things the moment they happen. Partially because they are not independent and because the initiators probably told them, drop it, park it, leave it aside, let it there. And partially because many of these people have no interest, many of the journalists have no interest in those topics and they don't report it. So I think that the problem with the media reporting occurs there. Because if they keep it on the front pages and they keep it as on the agenda, it will still be important for the people and they could follow up eventually, at least with a question towards the local parliamentarian and towards their party or to something, why don't you follow up on this? The third element that I see very important in terms of media is that, especially with deliberation, there is no media coverage. Absolutely no media coverage of anything, not even with participatory budgeting. My hometown in Romania has the first participatory, my adoptive hometown in Romania has participatory budgeting since 2013. I've never read in the newspapers anything more than the results of the project that got approved through participatory budgeting. They don't speak about the process, they don't speak about the voting times, they don't speak about how you can discuss, nothing, absolutely nothing. And that has been around for more than 10 years. Media coverage is problematic. Same in Hungary. When Hungary organized the first citizens' assembly in Budapest against pollution, I was lucky to be there, and it was during the pandemic and super strict rules and everything, but they still organized it. Almost nothing in the media. It was in one or two newspapers, a small column somewhere there, well hidden, but other than that, very, very little about it. So I think that is the problem. The visibility of these tools limit their potential. The topics, again, the media choose what is salient and what is not for them. But the real problem occurs when reporting on these democratic innovations, in my view, and that explains a lot the sort of variation between them. You are right, because they report a lot on the referendums because they find a conflict, and media report on conflict. We all know that conflict sells very well. But then on deliberation, it's the opposite of conflict. It's about consensus. It's about agreement. And unless the recommendations are the complete opposite of what the local authorities want, probably they would not pick on those things. And also the problem is that very few journalists attend these sort of things, or if they attend, they come for the first half a day and then they go because they see that there's nothing spectacular in 50 people talking about pollution or about how you can curb some local level problem. If it is about immigration, if it is about economy, if it is about big topics, probably that would be in place. But very, very good point, and that's something that I'm currently working on. I'm trying to see the framing through which media portrays, especially the local deliberation in some of these countries, because it came to my mind a few years ago that they don't care, and you're correct. They don't report about it.
Hi. Thank you. Is it on? Yes? Okay. So thank you so much. It was super, super interesting. I have two, it's not exactly questions, but comments that perhaps can lead to some fruitful discussion. So the first one regards the question, and I struggle to see referendums as a democratic innovation. So because in your definition, you say specifically they are alternative models, they mark a shift from a vote-centric to talk-centric engagement approach. But referendums are exactly a vote-centric approach. And as you often said multiple times, they have been around for a while. In cases like in Austria, they are inscribed in the constitution since 1920, I think. So I struggle with talking about referendums within this general research question about what happens to democratic innovations in political settings, struggling with representative democracy. But I will wait to see your reply to that. The second comment is one of your conclusions makes a lot of sense, and it is that these practices often exist, but their functioning is questioning, right? Because they give the sense and the feeling of engagement and power to citizens, and then in my case, I work on parliaments, and public engagement and parliaments and citizens relationship, and I also see that in established democracies. So I think that comparison could be also made, because often parliaments are experimenting with democratic innovations like consultations process, crowdsourcing, legislative crowdsourcing, and so on, but the tools are not equipped to be meaningful in any way. So I see that every time. So I would say that your conclusion makes a lot of sense, of course, but I don't know if that's so different from what happens in some cases with democratic innovations in established democracies, where in fact the tools in place and the practices in place also are not equipped to be meaningful in any way, and sometimes they are even performative, which you probably see that with the cases you have studied. So it's just a reflection on that. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. Both referendums, both direct democracy and deliberative democracy have been around for more than 2,000 years. Athens had both. Kletorion is one example of this. The way in which, I know, it's an ongoing discussion what goes under democratic innovation. Some will say referendum, if direct democracy goes, some will say it doesn't. I say it goes because it's not only a vote-centric. A vote-centric means that you have an election, you decide who you vote for. You don't discuss about the policy, you don't discuss about anything apart from eventually, if you are lucky and informed, the qualities of the person who's going to govern, or what they did, or how they look like, or those sort of things. You're focusing on the person and on the vote. Even if it's a referendum, you talk to other people, because often there are studies showing that in referendum campaigns, the level of communication is much higher. The focus of the policy is much higher. Even what the media report is completely different than in elections. So in that sense, even referendum campaigns allow an exchange of ideas, a reasoning, a judgment, because you're not positioning, you're not orienting yourself towards a candidate. You're just trying to defend a policy type of vote. Of course, the definition that I used is more steered towards deliberation, because I wanted to make sure that deliberation is captured in there. But yeah, you're not the first one to challenge the idea of direct democracy being part of it. I'm on the opposite side, is that I'm annoyed by the fact that democratic innovation is now reduced to deliberation. I think it's not that. It's so much more than that. I think it's participatory democracy in every direct form that doesn't involve a mediator, basically. That's how I would see it. In terms of novelty, again, none of them is new, but that's not the point. They are called democratic innovations, and this is already in 2009, 2010 in various books. We call them democratic innovations because they have never used before the way we use them today. Because even in Athens, when you said citizens, it was just male. It was not slaves, it was not women. You don't have a citizenry involved, you don't have a sort of voice of the whole society as part of it. In referendums, for most use of referendums, at least until the 21st century, again, the citizenship was reduced to a segment of the society. Nowadays, we have the whole society being able to participate in this. Now, how novel they are, how new they are, it's an ongoing discussion, and that's the beauty of it. We can discuss about it. And my approach was to be a bit more inclusive, just to illustrate the way they go. Yeah, you're completely right. It can, the democratic innovations can be void, also in also in established democracies, but the density is lower. This is what we observe. Yeah, I'm not saying that it's not, and I'm not saying that in established democracy it's an ideal world, but what we see is that it's more in those countries than in established democracy, which is absolutely normal due to all the constraints that they have. And in that sense, I'm inclined to say that sometimes what we mean by a deliberation in an established democracy will have different features than a deliberation in those settings. And the fact that in those settings they achieve, I don't know, just to put a number on it, 75-80% of the characteristics in an established democracy, it's already a performance, because the constraints are so much higher in those countries. The political setting, the initiator, the sort of forces around it, it's so much more complicated. Yeah, you're completely right. And you're also completely right to say that also in the relationship with parliaments, we have exactly the same type of situation all over the world. That's why it's only 1/5 of the countries around the world are called democracies right now, because of all those problems and all those constraints that are not showing a proper functioning. Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Sergiu. It's a pleasure to have you for more than the 10-15 minutes format of the conferences we used to meet usually. So it was very nice having you for a longer time and to see like how all the papers and books that you participated in contribute to a broader picture. So it was a very nice talk for the big lecture for democracy. I think that's perfectly in line with the idea. So thank you for that. I have 3 to 4 points, many minor ones. Going back to your questions and the way you answer about the Romania referendum, about the fact that there was a huge boycotting, I was wondering if low turnout is not a sign of saliency of the topic, because you see what I mean? Like, okay, if there was a massive boycott, then this very low participation could be a sign that actually it was salient because people refused to participate. But that's probably minor. I also had these same comments like Sophia about the comparison Western-Eastern. And one point that I never thought about before and that you raised is the role of external actors. And I think that will be different, and that place these countries, you know, like under the pressure from other actors that consider themselves more democratic. And I think this angle is very interesting. And I was wondering if you have more on that, more papers on that, focusing only on this element. Also, how much do the countries you look at could be compared to other countries or group of countries elsewhere? Like, I don't know, Latin America would be the example, but probably you already thought about it and you know a lot of literature from these countries. So that could also be an interesting comparison, or if you think about other groups of countries. And then about the within this group, like the variation, you also raised that point. There is no clear trend that like all these countries are so different, like between themselves and like between Eastern and Western. I don't know, like do you think there's like some countries that are complete outliers within, like, I don't know, like Romania, Poland, Moldova, like if you have a scale from like, you know, like like in terms of openness to this democratic innovation or support, something like that, like would you see like ideal types at the aggregate level, like this country is like this country is like that, or this and this country, they look alike but not that other one? That would be super interesting. But I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Very, very good questions as usual. Yeah. Well, I was probably confusing the audience when I said that there was a boycotting on social media. It was from the young people in the cities. The interviews that we had was with the rural population that was the most religious and that was the most likely to vote, and yet it was under 10%, 10-15% in those areas. So we were very interested in saying, why on earth you didn't go voting? Because this is a religious topic, it's a moral issue. You would be normal. Of course, we didn't tell them you would normally be against it, and that was the whole thing. We literally had this. We don't care about this. This is not a topic. If you speak about economy, fine. If you speak about agriculture, fine. If you speak about urbanization, fine. We are happy. They gave us examples of salient topics that could have been done in a referendum. So in that sense, yes, it was salient for some segment of the population, but that's the informed, young, urban. You can imagine that's under 10% of the population, right, with these characteristics. But for most of them, up to 70, the other 70% who didn't go voting, it was an issue of salience, because we looked at the most likely segment that would basically participate, and for whom that would be silent. Yes, the external factors, there is an ongoing literature right now developed especially for the Eastern Partnership countries and for the Western Balkans, because that's where the most of the external factors come into play, also because they had the biggest struggles with this, that are discussing about the role of these organizations of external organizations in shaping democratic innovations, in telling them how to do it, why to do it. Basically, it's a partnership. So yes, it's probably an emerging literature, and there are already studies about this. So yeah, definitely, I can suggest a couple if you're interested. The Latin America, definitely. They can be compared. I mean, they can be compared, and I'm a big fan of comparison. I'm not a fan of zooming in and only having these sort of comparisons only for the country or only for a specific region. I like to look out to other countries. I like to see what is going on out there. So I think there is room for comparison, especially due to the particularities of these countries. So one-to-one comparison, it's easy between a country in the European on the European continent and other countries, and this way I'm coming back to your fourth. This is the problem. Many of them are outliers. It's very well, not many of them are outliers in the sense that many of them are chaotic. You don't know what's going to happen. There are a couple of outliers. So Poland, clearly an outlier in trying to push for the type of deliberative wave, following the deliberative wave. And there are a few reasons for this. I mean, the literature has discussed about it. And the closeness to Germany helps, the sort of influence, the type of local authorities not being aligned with the government helps. Alternation in government helps. Several things helped with that. Hungary was also an outlier because these were controlled. So it is the only country in which they were completely controlled until now. We don't know what is going to happen after the April elections. Bulgaria, they didn't have it because of the political instability. They had very few of these. They stopped with referendums roughly 10 years ago because of the political instability. They were too busy having elections. You cannot actually have elections and democratic innovations at the same time. So if you look into each of these countries, you can find reasons for which they look the way they look. But generally speaking, it's quite unpredictable. I mean, when I went in Moldova and had questions and had interviews in Chisinau with people, I never expected to have a citizens' assembly in 2025. Local authorities didn't know what that is. Maya Sandu never mentioned in her discourse this. In the upcoming parliamentary elections, they had elections in the fall of 2025. Nobody mentioned this, and yet they organized it in June 2025 out of nowhere. Of course, there was external factor. There was assistance from the European Commission. There were things happening, but you cannot know just because there is so much instability and so little predictability. The chaos can suddenly take a turn. But in terms of outliers, in terms of ideal types, there are 1, 2, 3 countries that are clearly into one cell, but you cannot have a typology with 28 cells. So that's the problem right now. You have so many different cells behaving in such a different way that is worth investigating further.
Hi, Sergiu. Yes, it's working. Thank you very much for the really nice presentation. I have 2 different questions. The first one is about the perceptions of politicians in these countries, of citizens. Do they have like very specific views on who should be participating? Who are the citizens? I mean, what are they able to do or not to do in these different mechanisms? Do you have any insights on this? And my second question is about and you know that's my main focus right now, the use of deliberative mechanism within party organizations. At first, I was very frustrated because one of the first table you showed, you had that empty cell about centrifugal mechanism within party organizations, like institutionalized ones. But at the end of the presentation, you showed us another table about the views of party members on the usefulness or like the opportunities that this mechanism are to handle certain things. And can you expand a bit about what you mean by internal problems? I think that was the label. What do you mean by that? And internal problems. Could you expand a bit more, please?
Yes, great questions. Thank you very much. The first question is about the competence of voters, right? How do they see the I suspect that is the angle. They don't get that far. They don't even put themselves the problem of how competent the voters are because they struggle to understand the usefulness of deliberation. Why should we bother with this? The competence of voters occurs when you start being afraid. What if we give them power? What if we ask them to do some things? They didn't get that far. They are in the one of the graphs that I showed. It's just if you saw the sort of labels that they put to deliberation is very basic. It's probably after you've read read 1 or 2 articles about deliberation, probably you'd give more advanced answers than that. They don't have that advanced understanding. So to them, the competence is in a different galaxy. It's very far. They haven't thought about it. If these things, of course, we didn't have this sort of conversation with Polish politicians, because Polish have been exposed to this. So that could be probably one of the avenues. The one that you saw is in settings where it didn't happen, just because we were curious. Okay, what is your initial take about this? So in that sense, they didn't get that far. It's worth investigating in settings where they actually were exposed to this, and to see, are they thinking about the competence, people are not that competent to share the power with this, not let them decide. So yeah, it's a big, we don't know yet. For those settings in which they happened, in the settings in which deliberation doesn't occur, they don't get there at all. Good. This is in party politics, so just a bit of promo. It's the special issue that was edited with Bettina and David Farrell. It will be out in a couple of months, but all the articles are online. So what we meant by internal problems is when you we asked them, we gave them, I mean, it was an interview, so we could do a lot of things with them. So we told them, you have internal conflicts. In case of an internal conflict, in what way would you think that, I mean, would direct democracy help? Would deliberative democracy help? Basically, we didn't ask them that like this, because that would be a guiding question, a leading question, but that was the idea behind it. So internal problems means mainly conflicts, miscommunication, but then many of them went to internal communication when we were trying to get a miscommunication type of thing. Who decides? Gridlocks, deadlocks, those sort of things, basically. That's what we presented to them. And we asked them before that, did your party witness any? And we had variation. Even within the same party, there were people who said, no, never, and others said every day. So it's difficult to moderate, to understand what is the effect of that. Also because these people came from different branches, so probably in some branches they were more conflictual, and in another branch everything was silent. But in general, whenever we ask them, how can you have these things accommodate these problems or solve these problems, they are all shifting towards deliberation. They said, no, actually referendums will make problems worse. If you have a conflict, you cannot have a referendum, because people will align on those camps and they will separate. And that was the case from parties that didn't use it and from parties that use it. So they were very convergent. So in that sense, they perceived referendums as being conflictual and deliberation as being consensual. So in that sense, the internal problems was the one where they saw most of these things happening.
Any other questions? Okay, I have also one, Sergiu. It's more of a question to hear your thoughts, because how you presented in the first part of the presentation, the supply sides. So I'm just so the sort of beginning, actually. So how parties use it, how political elites use it, and so on, whether they want it or not. And I had a feeling it was kind of, that's my feeling perhaps, it was kind of a pessimistic or a skeptical story. You focused on instrumentalization, you focused on the fact that parties and elites have limited knowledge and so on. So I was wondering, do you think that way? So do you think it's are you pessimistic about when parties and elites start to use democratic innovation, start to adopt it, is that a pessimistic understanding of it or not? Should we be skeptical when they do it? And second, they also try to understand why, because of course there's a strategic aspect of it, right? That parties, it's the competition between different models of democracy, and they will lose power when they adopt these innovations. But I'm also wondering about the element of insecurity there, because for parties it's linked with a very high insecurity when they try to do this, right? It's about not being sure how to do it. It's also about not being sure about the outcome. So whether that plays a role, and I think it's also, also a question about how they assess the risk and the gains on the short and the long term, right? Because what you said about it's an electoral strategy, it's about an opposition strategy, it's about harming competition. It seems a bit short term, But do you think there are indications also about what the gains on the longer term might be when they use or support these kind of initiatives? It's a messy question, my apologies for that.
No, it makes sense. I wrote various components of the question. Oh, thank you. It's actually 4 questions. It's good. I'll answer all 4. And then we head to the spectacular reception. That's the reason for which I came, actually, for the reception. Nothing else. Good. I don't think it's a pessimistic. I don't see it as a positive or a negative, pessimistic, optimistic. Well, I see it as what it is. Basically, based on their behavior, we observe that they instrumentalized almost all of these elements, especially the direct democratic ones. Now, if things will happen, it will change in the future. I'm happy to report about that as well. But in this case, we noticed that they had these very short-term, very egocentric or very opposition-oriented types of goals. So to me, I don't see it as good or bad. It's just what it is. It's the way it is. So that's why, I mean, I'm absolutely fine if they instrumentalize it, because when I presented, I remember when I presented one of these papers 4 or 5, no, more years, because 5 years ago was pandemic, so 7 years ago, when I presented it, they said, hey, but everybody instrumentalizes a referendum. And I said, yes, in a way, yes. If you look at it, depends on the angle. A referendum is always instrumentalized. You use it in a certain way. So in this case, they use it to their own benefits, either policy-oriented or institutional. But yeah, it can be that at a certain moment there will be a wave in which they use it genuinely because they care about better policy. In this case, they didn't really care about better policy in most of the situation, because the fact that they didn't implement the non-binding ones shows that they didn't actually care about the policy in itself. And then once they achieve their goal, their objective, they just let it aside. Your second question is, yes, strategic components, insecurity. Yes, some parties are insecure. Some parties were super secure, like Orban, when he called a referendum in 2016 against the migration quotas, because if you remember, that was a referendum in Hungary, and he lost it. People voted against they boycotted the referendum, and the referendum didn't pass. He called a referendum because the European Union was imposing quotas on the member states, and he was confident that the Hungarians will back him up. Well, surprise, they didn't back him up. It was super secure on that, and that's why he initiated. So it was like a two steps back for Orban in that case. So I think it's alternation. Sometimes they are insecure and they say, okay, let's gamble, let's see what we get, and then after doing a bit of strategic calculation, say, okay, we've got nothing to lose, even if people turn against us. But if they don't, and if they are with us, we just forget about it. In other cases, they are very secure, they call for it, it backfires, and then they do something to navigate through the backfiring. Some do, like Fidesz, because Fidesz won the next elections. Some don't, because there were referendums that backfired in Slovenia, in Slovakia, in other countries. Or Bulgaria, they initiated, lost the thing. I would suspect, knowing political parties, knowing politicians a bit, I would suspect that they have short-term, medium-term, long-term type of things inside. But until now, their behavior didn't show. The long-term type of thing that they showed was this thing that they constantly keep the thing in standby, and whenever there is the topic allows to bring it back, they bring it back. Just to give you an example, there was a referendum in 2009 in Romania on reducing the number of parliamentarians. Romania has way too many parliamentarians for the population. It has 500 and the population is 20 million. They should have under 300, according to Tagepera's formula and according to normal standards. The country president ran a campaign in 2009. His electoral campaign was this referendum. We want fewer parliamentarians. People voted for fewer parliamentarians because that's reducing costs, all that. It has been parked for 15 years. Whenever the issue of corrupt politicians, too high expenditures is on the agenda, the president or people from the party of the president, they bring it up to the agenda all the time. Say, look, people voted in it. Why don't we use it? So the government is guilty for that. So all the time is weaponized. So I think that is the sort of long-term type of strategy that they have to weaponize it, constantly weaponize it. Keep it in standby, weaponize it whenever you have the possibility. But other than that, I haven't seen any long-term type of strategy. Well, not me. The studies, the previous conclusions don't show any type of long-term strategy when approaching these sort of things. It's very often short-term, 80-90% of the case, 10%, 15% of the case, medium-term. But other than that, there is not much going on. Although, knowing the politicians and knowing that they don't think necessarily, short-term, let's get re-elected in the next 4 years, I would have expected a bit more of a strategy. So to answer yes to your question, I think it's much more than strategy there. I think it's a mix. It's insecurity, it's other factors, it's willingness to explore. Because some of these things, if some of these guys do it because they have the willingness to see, okay, how will people react to this? Genuine willingness to explore. That's on the more positive side, rather than simply using it.
And then I think we're going to pick up on your cue and head to the reception, so we can have a drink together and perhaps discuss also a bit more about this very interesting topic. So thank you very much. I agree with, I think it was Caroline who said it was very, very nice presentation, also like really fitting the whole format of Big Ideas for Democracy. So thank you very much for this. Let's go outside and have a